Welcome to this IR35 discussion between some of the most knowledgeable people in the business about this controversial and frankly rather irritating legislation that just won't go away. It goes into full force next April with regard to the private sector, with some new rules that Parliament took some time developing that were previously put into force for the public sector. And we're going to be talking around all kinds of issues with IR35 today. I'm Dee Dee Doak. I'm the editor of Recruiter Magazine. I'm with Dave Chaplin, founder and CEO of IR35 Shield and Contractor Calculator. Neil Carberry, who is CEO of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, and Crawford Temple, who is the CEO of Professional Passport. Well, let's get our discussion underway, gentlemen. IR35 coming up in April 2021. The recruitment industry has certainly taken a hit, like many other industries, since the COVID-19 lockdown started last March. And the 1-year delay to off-payroll was welcome. But now, during the time when recruiters are starting to get back on their feet, then they have this to deal with and ready for April 2021. Neil, how is the industry now coping, and do they have the resources and frankly the impetus to prepare for this now, or are they maybe going to wait to get ready until early next year?
Well, thanks, Dee Dee, and it's a pleasure to join you as always, and good to get the focus onto this really important issue for the industry. I mean, you could hardly pick a more roller coaster year if we think about the impact that the lockdown had on temporary and permanent recruitment in the UK through March and April. We've seen at the REC things starting to turn positive, first with temps in July and August, and then with perm in September. So people starting to get some belief back in their plans. Of course, as we're recording this, we're looking at a potential second spike in the virus, and we don't know how that will play out, albeit that it's pretty clear that the mood of most clients is to try and trade through this time rather than battening down the hatches. So maybe we can be a bit more positive about the potential impact on the market of a second difficult few months. IR35 is a fascinating issue in the private sector because for so long it's been the dog that hasn't barked. If we think about it, the first budget that I was in post for as chief executive of the REC was in the autumn of 2018. Back in those days, we had this mythical figure called Philip Hammond, who used to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You may remember him from some black and white photos that you have around the house. And that was when the first year's delay was put in. And back then, the arguments that many people, including the REC, were making were exactly the same as we made up until the kickback of the implementation earlier this year. It's about not making one tax change when there's a wider question to address, covering issues like umbrella regulation, but also thinking about how we tax people fairly for the risks that they're taking and the benefits that they get. What's interesting now is fairly clearly, as has always been the case, the HMRC and the Treasury are determined that this happens in April. And so the first thing I'd say to people watching is don't go betting that the dog doesn't bark this time. It's definitely going to happen. The silver lining of that is we've got a longer run-up than we had. If you remember back to pre-COVID days of late February and early March this year, we were still waiting 3 or 4 weeks out from potential implementation for critical parts of the legislation. We've got that legislation now. So, for instance, at the REC, we've launched all of our new contracts in October, ready for next April, and members can draw down on that. So there's more stability in the material there. Government hasn't delivered on its part of the bargain. That's where our focus is. So how are we going to have a proper discussion about how we tax single open-ended contract employees? They're also not yet where they should be on things like umbrella regulation. So we'll keep the pressure up on that. But in reality, the kind of public affairs days of this policy are starting to move away. It's time that businesses got ready. And absolutely, I understand how difficult this year is. Lots and lots of REC members are dealing with not just the collapse of markets earlier in the year and the slow recovery, but the fact that clients are taking this as an opportunity to reshape what they're doing. So understanding changed client need is a really important theme that we've been exploring. And of course, many recruiters have impacts from the upcoming end of the Brexit transition period as well. So there's a lot going on. Bandwidth is very narrow. So it's very difficult to turn around to the industry and say, you've got to get focused on this. But in reality, we have got to get focused on this now. My experience last year with the REC support was that REC support available for members before Christmas of 2019 was undersubscribed. After Christmas, I could not run enough courses to support recruiters getting ready for what was at that stage we expected an April 2020 implementation. Now, I am the last of the great essay crises. I love a deadline and running up against it, but this is one where you can't do that. So I think my big message is, I know how tough it is. I think there's lots that we still have to do with government. Really now it's about getting ready. And I think for agency owners in particular, thinking through who in my business is going to take a lead on this now, and how are we going to set a plan that makes sure we get to April in good shape.
Thank you, Neil. Dave, we saw the dress rehearsal of this last year. What did you see, and what are you seeing this year? A similar pattern in any way?
Yes, it's a fairly similar pattern. I think to repeat what Neil has said about it's the dog that never barked. It's definitely barking this year, in more ways than one, I guess. The legislation reached royal assent on the 22nd of July. This is law. Some people are talking about whether it can be delayed again or whether it would be repealed, but there's not actually anything to delay because it's already legislation, and they don't just willy-nilly repeal legislation. It doesn't work that way. So there's a clear message that everybody must get ready for this. Now, last year we saw people come to the table very late. So I guess when I say last year, it would have been around January, February. This year, whilst there were lots of people preparing at the end of last year, which they should be doing right now, some people did leave it too late. There was in the early months, around about September, October, most people are doing all of their educational piece and learning about the legislation. And typically firms we saw completing that by the end of November with a view to implementing through December and January. So I would certainly urge firms, if they didn't get involved in the education bit last year, to do that now and just get ready to have a plan. And if the REC can help them with that, and that would be great. But they do need to be doing something. It's probably not the first thing on their list at all, but at least just get up to speed and have an idea of what you might do. Just the small start of a plan. I mean, I would urge them all to have a full plan right now, but that's possibly not realistic when they're trying to rebuild their businesses whilst they come out of the problems associated with COVID. But we saw last year all sorts of things. We saw firms fully prepared. We saw firms deciding not to hire contractors using PSCs anymore. We saw firms complete headless chickens, had no idea, even up to almost coming into March. So it's a complete mix, really. I would just urge everyone to prepare early. It's the easiest piece of advice, really.
Thanks, Dave. Crawford, from a compliance perspective and making sure supply chains are set up correctly, would you say that the market is ready at this stage, or is there more work to be done?
I think the market has moved significantly. We're seeing more and more and more of the agencies embracing the fact that accreditations of providers are required, and setting their stall out there. I think one of the things that was highlighted through the COVID situation and the coronavirus job retention scheme was where we've got to be a bit careful is recruiters having restricted PSLs or ASLs. So typically what we would advocate is a preferred supplier list at one level where a recruiter is going to agree with a limited number of providers, and those providers would be recommended to contractors who are new to the market, don't have existing relationships. The ASL is the key point. There's a lot of contractors who have built long-term relationships with their providers and been using those providers for considerable time and built up benefits and rights by doing that. And I'm not sure those are fully understood and appreciated across the recruitment sector. And what we saw with the coronavirus job retention scheme was people who had taken out a contract and being forced to change the provider, the umbrella provider they were using. And actually that made them ineligible for the coronavirus job retention scheme because of the dates. And so I think the one thing the sector's got to look at is a much wider scope under the ASL. So if a contractor comes and is using a provider who's got an established accreditation, then it should be considered that that contractor can continue with that relationship rather than be forced to change. And that fundamentally is one of the benefits of contractors being in umbrellas, is they build those rights through that long-term relationship. And if they keep being forced to change by recruitment company and recruitment company, then I think it undermines some of the part of the positive proposition of an umbrella. I think it's different where it's a brand new contractor into the market and an agency can run a PSL that's a limited number with particular providers that they've agreed. But it's the ASL side that I think they probably need to understand a little bit greater.
I think that's a really good point, Crawford. And if we think this through, just generally my experience of CGRS, the furlough scheme, it was the agencies who'd already thought about the structure of their contracts for both people that they payrolled and people working through umbrellas, and had clarity and sustainability through the contractual structure they'd built that was well designed for their business. They hadn't just agglomerated a contractual structure over 10 or 15 years. Those agencies were able to navigate complex new things like the CJRS well. And I think some of the lessons of that we can apply to IR35 changes as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yes, Crawford, that was a very interesting and I think little talked about point regarding the ASLs. Let's go more fully into the area of compliance. Tell us about the various regulations that some agencies may not have considered so much in the past. And Crawford, let's start with you.
Regulations. The ones that seem to be high up on the agenda are things like Criminal Finance Act, because that has implications. And that certainly has implications around the whole area of timesheet commissions and consultant commissions that are being paid and have often been used to generate business for certain providers. That's a commercial decision between an agency, a recruitment company and a provider. We wouldn't get involved in that, but certainly Criminal Finances Act puts a focus on that they need to consider. And parallel to that is the Bribery Act as well, obviously, which is often referenced. Others that are coming into the focus with so many people now going into the umbrellas, one of them is the agency worker regulations, because they will apply. Particularly now the Swedish derogation contracts have gone and you can't step outside of it. So where you're working with, let's say a PSL, and you've got that restricted panel, you can agree with those providers how you're operating the communication between you for the comparable pay data. And comparable pay has to be both the pay and the holiday entitlement. And so by setting that structure up and being very clear about that communication with the providers, I think helps everyone in the chain and keeps things very clear. A lot of the recruitment companies that we talk to, because agency worker regulations haven't really been a major focus, they've sort of ignored it because it hasn't been enforced to any great degree. And a number of them we have conversations with don't actually understand what the comparator data is or how it should be used, and think it's the rate that they're giving across to an umbrella. So I think there is an education piece for a lot of recruitment companies to properly understand the impact of AWR, the rates, and where people are moving into umbrella companies. And the other one that I think will take a huge focus is the conduct regulations. Because with moving through into the umbrella, what becomes really important is that the contractual arrangements between the agency and the umbrella company are structured correctly, which effectively would allow where it is allowed to be, the umbrella to agree an opted out contract and confirm that through with the worker. Now, one of the key parts that's often overlooked, and I did a session with 50 recruitment companies just before lockdown came in, and one of the key parts of the conduct regulations is the written notice. So a written notice has to be given of the worker status, and the recruitment company has to give the written notice to the end client. And in this conference, I asked the 50 recruitment companies how many of them could evidence the written notice on their conduct regulation status of the workers to the end client. One. There was one recruitment company that was following that process. And I think the recruitment companies aren't aware of the implications of not following that through, particularly when you put it into the off-payroll perspective, where you've got MSPs looking to go into large end clients and take over the management of the whole recruitment process. That could leave the smaller recruitment companies very vulnerable to losing significant amounts of their workers if they haven't applied the conduct regulations process correctly. And I'm not sure, because there's been no bite to the conduct regulations, and maybe it hasn't been enforced, although I do know from feedback we're getting that the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate are definitely, or were pre-COVID, out there enforcing it, which was causing a bit of confusion. So it's definitely on the radar and a major focus. And I would say that where you're working closely with your providers and you're working with compliant, responsibly run umbrella companies, it's very easy to agree what that process of communication is, and then they make sure they follow it through. So there's a lot of reasons why you would create a structure with your providers, whether it's PSL or ASL, you can create that process with them.
Thanks, Crawford. Dave, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the agencies obviously need to get up to speed with typically with all the regulations that will come into play now that they're hiring contractors on a different basis, because there are many agencies out there that only ever hired contractors using PSCs. So they won't be familiar necessarily with the agency workers regulations and the conduct regs. But the same thing applies for the contractors. They also need to get up to speed with understanding that actually the position now for them and the way they're being hired is different. So whilst they're used to being told, you know, this is how much the daily rate is, they need to understand that actually when the rates are worked out, what they're taking home might not be similar to before, and the rates will probably change in the market. Because they'll need to account for the extra employment taxes. So they need to understand that whilst the headline rate might be much lower than what they were previously earning, they're actually now getting holiday pay, they're getting sick pay, there's other rights and stuff associated with that. So that some of these things all come out in the wash. And the good thing is, I guess, is that from April this year, it became a legal requirement for agencies to publish a key information document. I'm not sure how many of them actually managed to get up to speed on this, what with COVID and everything, but I think the industry is pretty good at this, and there's plenty of providers that can help them do these, but it's just a complete transparent sort of calculation and layout, and it says exactly what you're getting paid and how the rate starts and who gets paid what and everything. So contractors need to ask for that, and also pay attention and make sure they know what they're signing up to, because then we don't end up in these situations where, and it's often the case where they thought they signed up for something that they didn't, and they only find out after their pay slip, and that just causes lots of problems, and it's all completely unnecessary, really. So, but they need to educate themselves as well. So I think they also have a duty, really, from a compliance perspective, to understand what the new rules are and how they're being engaged in a different way.
So I think both Crawford and David put the fingers on quite a lot of the challenge here. And if you think about the scale of compliance involved in bringing people into the payroll environment, we've talked about the agency workers regs, the conduct regs. Dave's absolutely right to point to the key information document. Really fascinating trend in the REC helpline is that we've been dealing with a lot of key information document queries in August and September, and that's because people had to start doing them when the market started to take off again. But we know that there's a lot of work to do to get them right. The other bit of, beyond the fraud and bribery implications, the other bit of legislation that people should always be aware of, because actually it's more of a touchstone for the industry than I think that we often allow for, is the Employment Agencies Act 1973. And there's just been actually a recent Court of Appeal judgment that has embedded some of the scope of that act. The reason I put that one on the table as well is not just about compliance with the conduct regs and with AWR and in terms of relationships with suppliers on things like bribery. It's also about not getting drawn into wizard schemes that you think you can get away with, because actually the law is pretty robust. And as Dave said, EAS are more active. They have more resource now. We work very closely with Ben Bruton and the team there. They were definitely reaching out to the industry in January and February, and they're going to come back to that, especially in light of the fact that we have this single enforcement body in the offing. So there's a lot of compliance for agencies to get right if they're coming into the part of the market that has always dealt with this. Now, I would of course say that the easiest and best choice for any agency is to get their support on that from the REC. Clearly, we've got lots of guides out there. The truth of the matter is, you probably want to find out something's a bit off when you're trying to get through the REC compliance test on joining, rather than when one of Ben Bruton's inspectors visits your office or worksite. So there is support out there. Really important. I think compliance is going to become progressively more and more important. We are on a train towards greater supply chain liability. And you begin to see that in the way IR35 works, and we'll go on to talk about that later on. But generally, there is a lot of pressure in the public square for that. If you look at what happened with Boohoo and Leicester and the pressure on their supply chain, big clients will want transparency, because transparency is the only thing that guarantees them some brand security. As agencies, we need to start thinking more about how we compete on quality and compliance, and that, I think, is going to be a really big theme for the market going forward. It's something that we're thinking a lot about at the REC.
Edie, can I just pick up and emphasise one of the points Dave made, which is, I think, as the market changes, and with off payroll, and you're going to get an increase in umbrella. Dave made the point about the rates and the presentation, and I think that is a critical part. So, where the recruiters present to a contractor that the rate is £25 an hour, it's making it clear that's the rate they're going to be paying an umbrella company, and not necessarily the rate the worker is being paid if it's on that basis. And I would advocate actually moving back to the situation where you've got the uplifted rate and a PAYE rate being given to a worker, so they can compare and see the reality between the two. And part of the confusion comes about because they're only being given this one rate, which is the umbrella uplifted rate, and their perception is that's my rate, and that's where the fallout happens. So the communication around the rate, and I know BEIS and employment agency standards would argue that's part of key information document territory, but the reality is, I think, how many workers are going to read and properly understand that would be my question. And I think the presentation of it from outset with the recruitment companies will ease a lot of the pressures in the market.
I think also getting the pitching of that right is really important.
Yeah.
Because where we see bad practice in the industry, and I'm the industry's biggest champion, and I think agencies do fantastic work across the country, growing client businesses and offering up opportunity to people. But we have a compliance function for a reason at the REC, and where I see bad practice is where people try and arbitrage those two rates. So one of the things that transparency helps with is understanding how the two rates work, because clearly what we don't want is a world where people are offering people a rate that seems higher to work outside IR35, when in practice it's actually not higher in reality, and there is potential risk in terms of the fundamental of employment status in the UK for tax or employment, and they are different of course. Yep. Is that it's the nature of the work that decides the status, not what someone says it is. And we'll come on to why it's important for agencies to understand that.
Talking about the preparation aspects, how should recruiters be preparing for this?
Well, I'll pick that one up first, Dee. I think first and foremost, you've got to get your head around what you're being asked to do. So that means understanding things. There's a great guide for REC members available on our website, and there's lots of other good material out there. Actually, one of the advantages of having had 2 delays is that people have thought about what it is that recruiters need to do. You need to have some leadership, so some clearly defined leadership in your team, and that might be different to what has happened before because of in a perfectly good year you might have more of your senior team focused on how to cope with this. You might need a smaller, much more focused team now. I think the most important thing is not to rely on people outside the business to get this right for you. Lots of this is about you understanding the world, and clearly the REC will help with that, but also understanding where your clients are, having discussions with clients about where they're going, but not just accepting client determinations. That's not to say you should mistrust client determinations or indeed what PSCs say to you. It's about you feeling comfortable yourself that things are in the right place, that the right determinations about whether roles are inside or outside IR35 have been made. Case in point for me, drivers. Okay, I really struggle with the idea that drivers who work for the same company every day are genuinely self-employed. Now, many of our kind of driving agencies at the REC have said to me, actually, we're not. We think it's just time to get this in and clean it up. So there's one of the reasons why at the REC we haven't kind of gone hard against any IR35 change now is actually there are parts of the economy where we do need this clear up, but the test is agencies feeling secure that the right determination has been made by the client and having a mature enough conversation with the client if that is not the case. Now, there's always a risk there because we know the client conversation that goes, well, if you won't do it, someone else will. But the truth is, we live in a world where brands can be damaged overnight. And, Greg Savage, the great guru of the recruitment industry, says you've got to pick your clients well. And I think this is one where you need to have some care for the reputation and standing of the agency. Get your compliance right, compete on quality, feel confident that the right determinations are being made, and you can approach the change. It is a massive change, and it will cause issues in the market. It's one of the reasons why we don't think government's done all the work it should have done before the introduction. But I do think that if you get your own preparation right with your own team making decisions for your business, you don't buy in on magic bullet solutions, because there are no magic bullet solutions. Statement of work has a role in this, but it's not going to solve all your problems. Then I think you're in a good place. And that's a tough message, because I'd love to have here's the IR35 answer for any business, but the right combination of measures will see well-run agencies through this in good health and able to sail past this as we hopefully power back from the pandemic.
Thank you, Neil. Dave, any comments
there? Yeah, it's interesting you pick up on some of the areas of the industry where we know that HMRC are typically trying to crack down, and drivers is one of them. I mean, some of the signs we saw when clients have approached us and we asked them, well, what's the daily rate of a particular contractor? And when they're talking about drivers, they say, well, actually they're on £12.63 an hour. And you think, well, this isn't someone who's running their own business, sourcing their own, work and so on. And, yes, and we guarantee them 40 hours a week and that type of thing. That whole driving industry did go that way, because once one firm does it, then the others have to follow suit in order to compete. And at those low margin sectors, that's where it can breed non-compliance. That's not to say, though, that some of those industries where, even though they're maybe on sort of more the gig economy on small jobs, they could be being hired on an outside basis. Neil said these drivers might work for the same company. They're doing all the jobs for the same company. Well, I would say to that, the professional referees were all working for the Football Association. They're all doing small jobs. They're allowed to refuse them. And that's gone to upper, and that's going to Court of Appeal. So are they the same as drivers? These are the questions that we just don't know. So it might be that one driving agency will be okay, but another one might not be, or some parts of it are and some aren't. And that's where all these grey areas come into play, and it really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The one thing to point out about the legislation is that agencies don't always have to take all of the tax risk on this. There is only an obligation to pass an SDS if it's inside down the supply chain. Because the idea of that, the behavioural effect, is that everyone does what they're supposed to be doing, assuming reasonable care has been taken. Everyone's paying the right amount of tax, and it also gives a chance for the contractor to say, well, actually, I don't think you've assessed me correctly. If it's one that says they can be paid gross and it's outside, then there's no obligation to pass that down the supply chain. So an agency could say to some of those more risky clients, well, okay, you've made that decision, but you hold on to that decision and that tax risk yourself, and don't force that on us. So there might be some ways of doing that, although, as Neil said, there's always another agency that might come along and say, well, actually, we will do that. But it's a very, very risky area, particularly with the debt transfer legislation. The debt can transfer to individual directors and everywhere. There's a big stick in this for everybody to get it right, and there certainly aren't any magic bullets at all.
Crawford?
Yeah, I think I agree with all the points that have been made, and I think from the provider perspective, I think one of Neil's points is critical about agencies being comfortable about the decisions they're making and what they're doing, and look at it from their own perspective. Because what we're seeing in the market is a lot of recruitment companies in certain sectors are creating relationships with providers that we wouldn't deem their offering as being compliant, but because it's giving such a commercial advantage to an agency, they want to believe the story because it means so much money to them. And so, part of it is all the time we've got recruitment companies that will work with providers on the margins and running solutions that are in at what could best be described as grey areas. I would probably go a bit further than that. You're going to have this pressure mounting on the recruitment sector. I think I wrote an article about 2.5 years ago that said, you know, depending on how the recruitment sector deal with the compliance of providers will depend on how the legislation will be framed going forward. My prediction at that time was, if the recruiters don't address provider compliance, we will see more and more legislation with built-in liabilities going straight back to the recruiters. And what's happened? Exactly that with the off-payroll legislation. Now, that wasn't the case when it went into the public sector. It's only been amended for the private sector. The public sector, the fee payer held the liability. They've changed it. Why? Because there were plenty of fee payers that the revenue wouldn't be able to recover the money from. And so they've learned that and said, when it goes into the wider sector, we've got to deal with it. The revenues just had a consultation that closed on the 30th of September on disguised remuneration. You know, a massive problem. They recognise that this is a massive problem and getting bigger. The point we've always made to the revenue is that these companies can only operate if they can access the market. So if the recruiters say, we are ready to deal with these organisations that are compliant, accredited or robust, then you shut down that opportunity for those companies. And the more recruiters that get on board with that, the more you can shut them down. And compliance has definitely come massively up the agenda. The thing we all have to take a collective responsibility in is what will happen is, as that tightens and it gets harder and harder to access the market, the non-compliant providers, as I would describe them, will find more and more and more ways of disguising what they're actually doing. And it's probably the recruiters that will be able to identify them before anyone else. And the sharing of that information, I wrote an article recently that basically said, if a recruitment company is dealing with a provider and all of a sudden overnight they've suddenly got 50 workers going through this provider for no explainable reason, the chances are there's something going on in the background that shouldn't be going on. And I think the more we share that information and the more transparency across the trade associations, the compliance accreditations, everything, the more robust the market becomes. That closes the opportunities for the mass marketed schemes and the, as I call them, have I got a good idea for you? And it just shuts them down. And I think it will start to move the focus off the sector. There's been so much going on, and some of the stuff we're seeing now, you know, they're still talking about loans and advances, but they've become so gun-ho with it, they're just not even reporting the loan or advance on the RTI, and they're not even bothering doing paperwork to support the fact that it's loan and advance, because they know it doesn't work. They're just calling it that in a text message to a contractor to pay them tax-free. And
that's not even a tax avoidance scheme, is it? That's just tax evasion. That is downright fraud,
I mean, well,
frankly.
It's fraud. It sits in fraud in my eyes. But the point is that all the time, if it's down to a contractor to make the decision, the contractors are uninformed regardless of how much information is out there, and they will chase the financial gain because they're under huge financial pressure. They don't understand how enforcement works and the fact there's an element of RTI, PAYE, and so the revenue's got the shopping list when they identify the provider, and that's what happened with the loan charge arrangements. So it comes down to the recruitment companies and the compliance accreditations to work far more closely together, and recruitment company trade bodies to work really closely together to identify these organisations and prevent them from having any access to the market. And then I think that puts us in a much stronger position.
Just on that, I think that point around, you know, how do we tackle this together is really important, because there's two sides of the vice here. One is, yeah, absolutely, us as an industry focusing on compliance and quality. We're just launching at the moment at the REC a new training course on how you compete on compliance and quality. And some of it is having the wherewithal to stand back and say, no, we don't feel comfortable with this. The other side of it is, what does the law help us to do? So, I've gone on until I'm blue in the face about umbrella regulation. And one of the things the REC has been doing is helping BAs understand what an umbrella company is and what one isn't. Because in reality, and this is not a criticism of government, civil servants do not, it's whack-a-mole's been borrowed for other causes this year, but civil servants struggle with how this market is structured, and we know that the people who are working within it and coming up with some of these silver bullet style solutions, they're super smart, and they know, clause 10 subsection C part 3 of whichever tax code you like really well. So there's also a need for a much more robust discussion between government, bodies like the FCSA, umbrellas, recruiters, bodies like the REC, about what we can do with our standards, what the REC badge should mean. And one of the reasons we're really keen on quality and compliance at the REC is that an REC membership should be a mark of quality, of doing things the right way. We think it is. But on the other hand, we also need to be helping government and not just fearing government, because the truth is, they're not. The government is not in the business of putting either agencies or umbrellas out of business. What they're trying to do is understand a complex problem, and the people actually that we should want to help them understand that are us, the people who are in the market, not people who start from maybe some more hackneyed points of view about the flexible labour market more generally. If we go back to the land before the lockdown, and what Matthew Taylor, the Director of Labour Market Enforcement, was saying then, he was talking in terms of a more robust form of industry self-regulation. And what he meant by that was genuinely more robust. So we're making some changes to the REC compliance test and the guidance around the code at the moment to increase expectations. But Matthew's looking for something with more teeth and probably a bit more coordinated, because the last thing you want in a market where there are multiple potential passports for people to have is for people to fail through the Professional Standards Committee at the REC, and then be able to recover a passport somewhere else quite quickly. So and that's a big challenge to all of us in the market, about how do we deliver that as things go forward, given that the alternative might be some quite ill-fitting government action.
Yeah, I think we're all responsible for making sure the market stays compliant, and frankly, 95+% of the market is compliant. So we are only talking about a very small number of non-compliance here, but we end up with this huge amount of regulation to just solve some of the problems that can be quite small. IR35 itself, I wouldn't pitch that as a non-compliance issue, because I don't think the original legislation was particularly fair. I can see what they're doing. It's a tax raising revenue piece. It's quite a lot of admin burden to raise that. But again, it comes to compliance, and it's our job to make sure that all of the companies are compliant. And as Neil, as you said earlier, they don't want their brand and their reputation being dragged through a tax tribunal. They want to get it right. So we shouldn't be doing any of these sort of, have I got a good idea for you type things, and, lip service processes. And in 4 years' time, they've got a problem. We need to make sure there's, belt and braces and good compliance in place. And going back to Crawford's point, all the information is there to do that. We collect all of this data between us, and it shouldn't be that difficult to work out if someone's getting paid too much and not enough tax has been taken. So there has to be a way to do that, and to try and shut down that non-compliance.
Well, then you'd have to make sure that it was GDPR compliant.
Yeah, DD, I think when I've spoken to the revenue about it, the standards we're talking about are at such a high level that there's no personal data being shared. And the concept that where I'm at, it's not about saying we want this for professional passport and no one else. The concept behind it is trying to get a different thought process applied to recognize how commercial bodies in the market can use information to apply within their standards without saying to someone, you're not compliant. And that's the big difference. That's the advantage we've got in this part of the market. We can say, you just don't meet our standard, full stop. Whereas with the revenue, if they make a statement about you're not doing it correctly, it has much greater implications to a provider. And I think if we can get the key departments to recognize that differential between our side of the fence and their side of the fence, and then work closely together for them to help us because they're the ones that have got all the data, then it's quite easy for whether it be FCSA and professional passport to apply exactly the same standard across all of the providers for the data that's provided from the revenue. And it will create that level benchmark. And I think there's got to be a coming together of all of the, we're better than them and mine's bigger than yours and all that has got to almost go out the window, because the overall prize here is much greater. And I think pulling everyone together and starting to focus in the right direction, if everyone's making the same messages, there's a chance we might actually get there.
Well,
you know what? I think there's a real. Go ahead.
The April is coming up. Do you think that there is the opportunity to get a lot of these negative issues to settle down by that time? Do you have any thoughts about what you think will happen after April 2021 with IR35 and other compliance issues?
Well, for one of the challenges that we have at the REC is we've got to get all our members through the compliance test in the first half of next year. So we've actually got a vehicle to have this conversation with 3,300 agencies in the UK. So there is an opportunity here to kind of embed some of the stuff that's changed recently. We talked about the key information document, but also to start a discussion more broadly about what, as Crawford's been saying, what the base for the compliance and quality focus that we will deliver as an industry is. And one of the things that gives me hope for that is, there are very few silver linings to COVID, but I do see a different nature of the discussion, in the industry. I started at the age of 21 on a desk as a recruiter, and I know how it rolls, right? We've all always had the best quarter ever. Actually, over the last 7-8 months, right from the kind of most senior people in the industry to high street owner-operated firms, there's a great deal of humility and openness in the discussion between agencies that I see at the REC now, and between agencies and suppliers as we try and work our way through all this together. That kind of humanity is important, and it's flown through to. It would be unusual for the REC chief executive to say this, but it's flown through to the discussions that are taking place between organisations. I have a regular call with Anna at school and with the guys at Team and with David at ALP and with the FCSA and so forth. There is the potential for us to do something like this. And I'm actually, I think that undefensiveness about how we steward our industry is quite important. It's certainly important to the REC, and ultimately our purpose is to serve and protect the recruitment industry in the UK because of the good it does. So I'm quite hopeful that there are some vehicles in the next year or two where we can really start to pick up this, and it will take time, and it will be difficult, and it will require individual agencies looking at how comfortable they feel with different parts of their operation. IR35, we've talked, Dave's picked up on this at length. But I'm more optimistic than pessimistic on this stuff.
Well, that's good. Good to hear. Dave?
I'm very optimistic about, I'm very optimistic about the compliance aspect, because when we had the dress rehearsal in last year, we didn't really see, I didn't see it, but I didn't see tons of, rogue payment companies entering the market. The compliance gang have got together. They've done very well over the years, actually, to put together compliance in their area. I think actually compliance will be fine. It does need work, but I don't think we're miles behind. I think we've also had time for everybody to prepare more. Neil touched on that earlier. Had it have gone through April this year, even without COVID, it would have been quite a bumpy ride, I think. But the education now is much more. The HMRC guidance is much better, and it's much more widespread than it has been in the past. They're doing quite a good job, actually. In quite a few areas. Normally I'm quite critical of them, but I actually think some of their guidance is really good now. So yeah, it's all there, and I think it's totally doable. The IR35 stuff has come still at completely the wrong time, and all of the arguments that were made last year for the delay could be made again absolutely right now, but it's law. So I mean, it would be quite a miracle if it was changed, but I think it will be a bit bumpy to start with, but I think we'll cope. The industry always bounces back, and I think the flexible workforce will recover.
Crawford, any thoughts along these lines?
Yeah, I think my view is what one of the things that we're likely to see, which really came back from the CJRS situation, is if you think about the current sector and how it operates, you know, the answer is umbrella. What's the question? Because that's where everyone goes. And I think what we've got to do is get a little bit more refined and sophisticated in what we're doing. And so if we use the headline of an umbrella, I think umbrellas will start to have different contractual arrangements in place depending upon the workforce they're dealing with, because some of the complexities in an umbrella contract are designed to allow workers to get expenses, because there's layers and layers and layers of complex tax legislation they've got to comply with to achieve that. Well, there's no point in putting all of that complexity in if a worker is never going to have the opportunity to claim expenses. So I think umbrellas will start to work more closely with the recruiters. They'll identify more appropriate contractual terms rather than one size fits all. And you're also seeing the emergence of new arrangements. So PEO, which is effectively an umbrella on a PAYE rate, which will allow the recruiters to work more closely, particularly in the low paid sectors where they're looking at national minimum wage, rather than using some of the "have I got a good idea for you" schemes. So I think you'll start to see these things being refined. I think the providers that embrace all of these different operational structures will end up in a situation where they can sit down with recruiters, they can look at sectors, they can look at the rates, they can look at all the different profiles within a recruiter's business and clearly identify the correct contractual and structure arrangements for each of those workers. And I think when we get to that and we stop this one size fits all, the answer's umbrella, what's the question, suddenly we'll start to become a little bit more professional. Suddenly we'll understand the benefits, and the workers will start to understand more the benefits of the arrangements they're going into. And in some cases, it may well be the agency operating a PAYE scheme. You know, there's a lot of different answers, and umbrella is not the answer in every instance. And I think we're already seeing different contractual terms to cope with potential future CJRS situations coming into the umbrella market. So I think there's been a lot of learning in a very short space of time. And, you know, in every way. I mean, look at us, we're all sat at home doing these, or maybe Dave isn't, unless that could be your bedroom, I suppose, Dave. I wouldn't be surprised. But so we've all had to adapt massively, and I think it's brought so much into focus, and we shouldn't lose that. I think there's a lot more that can be done.
That sounds very promising and very exciting, frankly. Well, we could go on for hours, I think, just about some of the points we've raised with the last question, but I think it's time for us to close out today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers: Neil Carberry from the REC, Crawford Temple from Professional Passport, and of course, Dave Chaplin from IR35 Shield and Contractor Calculator. I'm Dee Dee Doak. Thanks for your time.